Shalom. This is Daniel with Bless Israel Network, and this is another episode of Eye on Israel. Today, we're going to focus on the United Nations, the UN. Now, of course, we know what the U and the N are supposed to stand for, but in fact, there are many times when the UN actually stands for unfriendly nations, sometimes even unfair nations, and on occasion, sometimes unbelievable nations, right? Well, there's several different bodies within the United Nations as a whole. Today, in this brief little episode of Eye on Israel, we're going to be talking about the UNHRC, the United Nations Human Rights Commission, which used to be the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, but it changed its name in 2006. Let me read to you what their credo or their mission statement is, all right? The mission of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner on Human Rights is to work for the protection of all human rights for all people, to help empower people to realize their rights and to assist those responsible for upholding such rights. That's the first part of their mission statement. It sounds nice. In fact, if they were doing it, it would be terrific. But when it comes to the United Nations and Israel, Israel seems to be in its own unique category. And when I say unique, I don't mean that in a good or positive or edifying sense. Israel has been singled out by various aspects of the United Nations like no other country in the world. Let's get specific now in terms of this particular body of the United Nations. Again, the United Nations Human Rights Commission. We know they're supposed to be upholding and empowering the rights for all nations, right? Okay, well, let me share a little bit with you about how fair this organization has been to Israel. The UN Human Rights Commission or Council, from its creation in June of 2006, after it changed its name from the Commission on Human Rights, from June 2006 until June 2016, the UN Human Rights Council, in that particular period of time, adopted 135 separate resolutions criticizing various countries or nations. Out of that 135, how many do you think were against Israel? Now keep in mind, there's well over 200 nations in the world, right? 68 of those 135 resolutions singled out Israel. That's just about 50%. Now, when you think about it, of all the countries, and 7 billion people on the planet, Israel is one of the smallest nations in the world, takes up as much land space as the entire state of New Jersey, mind you, which is the 47th largest state in the US. And yet the UN Human Rights Commission seems to find it necessary to single out Israel virtually half of the time for critical human rights violation resolutions. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that there are many, many, many other nations that are much larger, that are committing all kinds of human rights violations, and yet teeny tiny Israel gets singled out for almost half of the resolutions passed by this UN body. That's kind of incredible fact number one. let me also give you a short list, well, maybe not so short, but a list of some of the current members of the UN Human Rights Council. Now, keep in mind, these are countries that, for all practical purposes, by definition of the organization, these should be beacons of human rights. Otherwise, why on earth would they be members of the Human Rights Council, right? So let's take a look at some of the current members. Bolivia, China. Now, we all know how believers are treated in China, and we all know about all kinds of other things that are going on in China, which are violations of human rights, but they're a member of the Human Rights Council. Cuba, another beacon of human rights. El Salvador, Indonesia, Mongolia, Philippines, Portugal, Qatar, or Qatar, depending on how you spell it. And by the way, Qatar or Qatar is the country right now that is the focus of a very intense dispute amongst a number of the Arab Gulf states. Qatar, if you don't know, is the home of Al Jazeera. And Al Jazeera is one of the most virulent, lopsided news organizations in the world, and is so anti-Israel. When they run reports on the news, and you see the little ticker going below, when they are doing a report from Judea, Samaria, on their newscasts it will say, occupied Palestinian territories. Occupied Palestinian territories, rather than what it actually is. And by the way, when you use that term, that's not a name. That is an op-ed headline. That is what someone chooses to call it. It's Judea, Samaria. Now, some people, a lot of people, use the term West Bank. That's fine for a lot of folks. But to say occupied Palestinian territories, that's the headline for an opinion piece. That is not news. That's opinion. And Qatar, by the way, is now, diplomatic relations with Qatar has been cut off by Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, a number of the Gulf states. So there's this brouhaha that's actually bubbling up within the Arab world itself. And Qatar actually is the biggest single financial supporter of Hamas. I don't know if you knew that or not, but yes, most of the money, aside from Iran, that comes to Hamas comes from Qatar. So going down the list of other beacons of human rights that are on the Human Rights Council, we have Rwanda, we have Saudi Arabia, which, by the way, I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but Saudi Arabia does not allow women to vote, does not allow women to drive, yet they're on the Human Rights Council. And by the way, women are not allowed to be out in public with another man unless that's her husband. So if a woman happens to be friends with a man and she is seen out in public with that man without her husband with her, she's subject to arrest. And they also have what they call, for lack of a better term, modesty police in Saudi Arabia, where women aren't wearing appropriate clothing, where they're basically covered from head to toe. They are also subject to be arrested. And yet, Saudi Arabia is on the UN Human Rights Council. Okay, and coming to the end of the list, we have Tunisia and we have Venezuela. Okay, Venezuela, another beacon of human rights. We all know what's going on down there these days. So let's talk a little bit more in detail about why is this body of the UN so anti-Israel? Well, I'm going to explain something to you which will probably answer your question that you may never have known before. The UN Human Rights Council divides the world into a number of different regions. Okay, you've got the African region, you've got the Asian region, the Latin American and Caribbean region, the Western European region, and the Eastern European region. Okay, now, the African and the Asian region have the most members. Each of them has 13 member states. The entire body of the UN Human Rights Council is made up of 47 member states. So if the two biggest ones, Africa and Asia, each with 13 states, decide to vote as a bloc, guess what? They comprise an automatic majority of the 47 member states of the UN Human Rights Council. Remember that. Latin America has 8 seats, Western European has 7 seats, and Eastern European has 6. Now you might say to yourself, where's the US? How come there's not a North American region or a US region or Pacific? What? Bottom line is, the US, which is the home of the United Nations, of which the United States ponies up about 22% of the overall budget of the United Nations. Where is it on the UN Human Rights Council? It's in the Western European group, which has 7 member states and can easily be outvoted by either the Asian or the African, and certainly when they both combine themselves. Now, here's where the rubber starts to meet the road. As I said, the African and the Asian region are the 2 largest ones. Both have 13 seats. Well, take a look at this map. In the map, you'll notice a bunch of dark areas in the Middle East, Africa, and over in Southeast Asia. Those areas are where all the heavily populated Muslim countries are in the world. Every single nation that has at least 50% or more Muslim population is a member of either the African group or the Asian group. Again, every single Muslim nation that has at least 50% or more Muslim population is either in the Asian or the African region of the UN Human Rights Council. So, again, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out. All they need to do is vote as a bloc, which they repeatedly do. And now you know why the UN Human Rights Council has passed so many resolutions against Israel. The way that the Human Rights Council has been set up, it is a stacked deck against Israel. Is this fair? Absolutely not. So we go back to what I said at the beginning. UN stands for unfriendly? Absolutely. Unfair? For sure. And based on how they act towards Israel, unbelievable nations. So I'll show you the map one more time so you'll see what I'm talking about, where all the heavily populated Muslim countries are. So there you go, friends. That's the nuts and the bolts, or the ups and the downs, about the UN Human Rights Council. That's all we have time for today. If this little episode or any of the other episodes of Eye on Israel blesses you, please consider going to our website, www.blessisraelnetwork.com, and get on our mailing list if you'd like, or if you feel led, please support our ministry. God bless you for now.